So we're going to start working on looking at mobile device programming for the Android devices. This brief presentation sort of covers the fundamentals, and then we talk a little bit about, um, how to actually set up your computer for Android app development. So as we discussed earlier in the semester, Android apps are written in the Java programming language, and basically you use the Android Studio IDE, which is similar to Xcode. So you use the Android Studio interface to actually write the language and write the interface. And then the Android software SDK tools, which stands for Software Development Kit, compile your code along with the data and the resource files into an Android package, which is a APK package. Unlike the iOS setup, you can actually package an Android application into an APK and hand it over to someone, and they can install it directly on their Android device without going through the Google Play Store. This is not really possible on a Apple device. If you wanted to distribute your app to a broad user group, you'd actually have to plug up the person's phone and simulate it on the phone, or put it in the Apple App Store so that it can actually be downloaded by others. So the APK package for Android, once it's installed on the device, it lives in its own security sandbox. So this is how that works. Is the Android implements the principles of least privilege, and that really means that each app by default has access only to the components that it requires to do its work and no more. So they can't modify system components, they can't modify components of other apps, or modify any of the native components of the device. So it creates a very secure environment which the app cannot access parts of the system for which it's not given permission. So the Android application has about 4 components. App components are the essential building blocks of an Android app. Each component is a different point through which the system can enter your app, and not all components are actual entry points for the user. Some depend on each other, but each one exists in its own entity and plays a specific role, very much like we discussed for the iOS device. Each unit is a unique building block that helps define the app's overall behavior. And there are 4 different types of app components. Each type serves a distinct purpose and has a distinct life cycle that defines how the component is created and destroyed. So the first one is the activities. And the activities is the single screen with the user interface. So the equivalent in iOS development was the storyboard. Well, for the Android device, it's an activity. And it's the single screen within the user interface, and one app can have several activities, like the iOS devices can have several storyboards. And they work together for the user experience, and each is independent of each other, but you will create the navigation within your app that will allow one activity to go to another activity. So an example would be a note-taking app. The launch screen probably has a list of notes. So the first screen might have a list of notes, and then there might be an activity to add a new note, an activity to actually modify an existing note. So those would be activities, and each of those specific features would take place on a single screen. So another component is the services. Service is a component that runs in the background to perform long-running operations or to perform work for remote processes. A service does not provide a user interface. So a service is implemented as a subclass of service, and we'll learn more about that in the Services Developer Guide for Android Studio. The other thing is content providers. Content providers manage the shared set of app data. You can store data on the individual device, and you can also store it in an SQL-like database, or you can and stored on the web. So we've talked a little bit about this with iOS and so a note-taking app, again, as used in this example as well, might store data on the person's device because there isn't necessarily a need for that data to live in a particular database. However, if one of the features of that app was that the person wanted to allow others to collaborate on the notes, then the data for that app would have to be stored on the web or some cloud data service that would allow multiple users to access that data from their own specific devices. So content providers are useful for reading and writing data that is private to your app and not shared. For instance, Notepad is a sample example, which I just talked about, and it just saves notes right on the person's device. The content provider is a subclass of content provider and must implement a standard set of APIs that enable other apps to perform transactions. So we'll talk a little bit more about content providers as well on Tuesday. Broadcast receivers are system-wide broadcast announcements. They originate from the system. For example, a broadcast announcement that the screen is turned off, the battery is low, a picture is captured. Apps can also initiate broadcasts, for example, to let other apps know that some data has been downloaded to the device and is available for them to use. A broadcast receiver is implemented as a subclass of broadcast receiver, and each broadcast is delivered as an intent object. We will talk more about the intent object. Overall, the intent is the same thing that we talked about in the iOS development, in which the user presses something, and once the user presses something, the screen is supposed to respond. And so that happens between the broadcast receiver and intent. So we'll talk in depth about both of those more on Tuesday. So I'm often asked about, what platform should people focus on making their apps available for? And I talked a little bit about this in class. I think years ago, it was either or, right? Windows phones, not so much, but Android phones and iOS phones are sort of the dominant platforms on the market, on the mobile market. And there was a time where more users had more than one or the other. However, that shift has changed. And, this quote said, if you want to be in front of the largest number of users, you will need to be on Android, which, because at that time, those devices were a lot cheaper than a Windows phone was. But, a very nice Android is going to cost you almost what a very nice iPhone is going to cost you. But I think this quote speaks to, the availability of the various devices and their price points, right? So an Android tablet, there's a variation of them at all different price points, making it more accessible for cheaper, right? But there's only one iPad, right? And you can't get any other Apple tablet device. And there's only one iPhone, but there's multiple versions of Android phones and multiple versions of tablets. But, I have clearly stated in this class repeatedly that it's not a one or the other thing. It's really having a little bit of skill in both areas, and then some developers tend to focus heavily on one area more than the other. But when it comes to building apps and taking on projects for companies, most companies expect to have their app available on both platforms. And so they tend to look for developers who can, or development companies or people who can secure, developers to build both apps. And some companies hire an Android developer, and some companies hire an OS developer. That truly happens. But all that to say is most apps are available on both platforms as other than it was in the past. And so, this quote might be somewhat true, but less true than it was when it was first sort of kind of published. So there's going to be the link to this presentation is available on Blackboard, and I want you to actually go and take a look at this video. It's a 10-minute video, and it's going to talk about getting started with Android Studio, sort of getting your computer ready for Android development. In our next class, we're going to go in depth into the 4 components, and then we're going to look at some samples of the Android Studio app and look at how you construct the interface using XML and how you actually build the features and the functionality with Java. For those of you who are not familiar with Java, there are 2 videos in the Blackboard in our course. One's a short one that's a refresher, and one's a little bit longer one. If you need to, you should review those videos because we don't cover much of the Java programming in class. So the next thing that you have to do is actually set up your development environment. And those of you who aren't familiar with Java need to do the Java refresher. And then we'll talk a little bit about XML, which is the extensive markup language. And in iOS, we built our interface using the Xcode interface, and then it generated the code that it generated in the background. Within Android Studio, we use XML, extensive markup language, and it does have, a WYSIWYG or drag and drop or whatever you want to call it, development environment. But some have found it easier to just actually write in the XML code. So we'll look at both in class, and the first thing you need to do is before you actually set up Android Studio, you have to install the Java Development Kit 6 or higher. The Java Development Kit 7 is required for developing Android apps 5 and higher, and you can also check to see if you have the Java Development Kit installed in which version by opening the terminal and typing jvac-version. If the Java Development Kit is not available or its version is lower than 6, you need to go to this link to download the latest version, and then you want to install Android Studio. Android Studio provides everything you need to start developing apps for Android, including the Android Studio IDE and the software development kits. One of the first things that I do is when I install Android Studio, I go ahead and just download all the software development kit tools that I might need for the lowest version of the Android OS that I plan to develop for. And as a developer, you would pretty much make that decision by what's widely available. I would go with what's most popular on most of the devices and the most stable version of Android Studio, because as we discussed in class, it's an open network, an open platform. And because of that, you have many people who are developing various versions of the Android iOS. So that's what's next. What you will need to do by Tuesday is set up your Android development environment, get it installed. It works on a Mac and a PC, and be ready to actually work in class.